Monday, so good to me. Monday morning, it was all I hoped it would be. Oh, Monday morning couldn't guarantee that Monday would still be here with me. Monday, can't trust that day. Monday, sometimes it just turns out that way. Oh, Monday morning, you gave me no warning of what was to be. Oh, Monday, how could you leave and not take me? Every other day of the week is fine, yeah. But whenever Monday comes, Monday cries all of the time. Monday.
Hi, this is Lisa, the captioner. I just need permission to caption. Can you hear me?
Good afternoon. Hi, Kim. I do hear you. So give us a minute. Holly, if you wouldn't mind making the second account of Kim Weissman's for captioning. And if not, I can get to that in just a moment. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. It's so good to be with you today. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us for this event, hosted by the Pulitzer Center and part of our new program here at GCC, the Pulitzer Center Campus Consortium. My name is Michelle Stonis. I'm one of the faculty at GCC. I teach in the history department, along with Dr. Root Cohen-Shore, who's in journalism and who's joining us today. We're in for a real treat to learn about some journalism and learning about how family definitions have been different around the world, and also what is it like to be a journalist and how can that maybe fit with some of our own career goals. So I would like to introduce Ms. Holly Rosewood. She's from the Pulitzer Center and she's going to take it from here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Really excited to see you all this morning or this afternoon, I guess it is now. I wanted to start by telling everyone a little bit about the Pulitzer Center. We're really thankful to have this great new partnership with Glendale and some really awesome opportunities for students as well. So I'm going to show a short video that will do a better job of explaining what our organization is better than I can. And then I'll briefly introduce Anna, who then can tell us more about herself. But before we do that, just this short video on the Pulitzer Center. And I'll share a link in the chat as well.
Here is a young, ambitious journalist. She is eager to travel the world, to get up close and personal as she reports on issues that affect us all. She contacts editors to pitch her project. They're interested, but with no budget for international reporting. Their hands are tied. Stuck and frustrated, the journalist gives up. When I was a young journalist, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch sent me to over 60 countries, covering stories just like this. Many news organizations had correspondents based abroad in bureaus across the globe. As the internet disrupted old business models, many of those stories went untold, and many of those news bureaus went dark. The issues hadn't gone away. They were more important than ever. But there were fewer journalists reporting in depth, and in the frantic quest for clicks and likes, more emphasis on the superficial and news of the passing moment. It was out of these troubling trends that the Pulitzer Center began, with the mission of raising money to support journalists in filling these gaps. Our approach has always been collaborative, connecting strong journalists and outlets large and small to reach the broadest audience, with an assurance to our grantees and partners of the independence that is crucial to responsible reporting. In our first year, we commissioned 9 projects. Now we support over 150 a year, working with leading news organizations in print, broadcast, and online. Along the way, we have sought out opportunities for innovation as a leader in showcasing our journalism through film festivals, photo exhibits, ebooks, and more. Our biggest innovation was to make educational outreach part of our core mission. What began as a few presentations at schools and universities has grown and grown to nearly 500 events per year. Teachers benefit from the online curricular materials built to bring our journalism to even more schools. Some students do their own reporting, exploring the local impacts of global issues. Others win Pulitzer Center International Reporting Fellowships. All benefit from the deeper engagement with global issues that the immediacy of journalism makes possible. The Pulitzer Center model has evolved and expanded, but it still begins with a journalist, an issue, and a story. Support from the Pulitzer Center makes the field reporting possible. Its network of news media partners and educational institutions assures that the reporting has impact. And it's that demonstrated impact that persuades foundations and individuals to invest in us, making donations that allow us to support still more journalists. To us, this is a virtuous cycle, efficiently making use of skills and resources to produce the sort of journalism that is a public good for all. So when that young, ambitious reporter comes to an editor with a strong idea, it doesn't end in frustration.
I think Holly fell off. So that's why the video ended. So we can take it from here. Anna Louise Sussman, I'm so glad you're with us today. I know you're an award-winning journalist. And in fact, I emailed out to the school all of the amazing places that you've been published. And I had to cut it short because it was such a long paragraph. National Geographic, New York Times. Would you please tell us a little bit about yourself as a journalist and maybe how you got into this field?
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. And it's great. Well, I can't see you all, but I'm looking forward to your questions and hearing more from you. I was smiling while I was watching the video, which to be honest, I hadn't seen before, but that little journalist, cartoon journalist, like kind of bestriding the globe, that really is how it works. Like I work independently. I'm a freelance journalist, and the way it was described in that video is really accurate, where you have your story ideas, which we can talk about how you generate story ideas if that's of interest, but you have your ideas, you have your relationships with editors, or you try emailing someone cold and they're like, oh, this is a great idea, but like, there's no way we could send you to wherever, you know, it costs a few $1,000s to go there. You're going to need money for a translator. You're going to need money for the plane tickets. And like, we just don't have that, but we can, you know, we can pay you for the story, but you need to somehow figure out how to get yourself over there. And Pulitzer Center, and apart from all the other great work they do, you know, on the educational side, you know, I know them as a journalist who, and I've had the great good fortune to be funded by them. And really without their financial support, it would be really hard to do what I do. So that, it's just, I hadn't seen it captured so kind of adorably and accurately in cartoon form before, but yeah, that's more or less what my life looks like. So I got into journalism, I always say, out of a kind of lack of originality. My parents were both writers. My dad was a humor writer. My mom is a journalist. She writes kind of about lifestyle stuff. And she always told me that journalism is fun. And I think that's true on a good day. Journalism's really fun. What it is, even when it's really hard, is interesting. I think of journalism as a way to explore questions and ideas that really interest me. At this point in my career, I'm really fortunate to be able to kind of pick the stories I'm interested in. You know, I tend to focus on an idea or a question, and then I think, okay, what's the right way to tell this story, or how can I explore this idea or this question that I have? You know, I was just listening to a journalist that I really admire talk about how he approaches journalism. He always starts with characters, with people. He looks for some sort of human conflict, and then from there he thinks about what are the big questions that this conflict is animating. And I tend to come at things from the opposite point of view. It's just, everyone's brain works differently. Everyone's inspired by different things. So, how did I get my start? I started my first journalism internships were when I was in high school. I'm really lucky to be based in New York City, is where I grew up. And there's a lot of big media corporate, companies here. So I was able to do journalism internships at the time. I was really interested in fashion. So I did internships at places like Paper Magazine, InStyle. When I was in college, I interned at Vogue. And then I got really interested in reproductive rights when I was a senior in college. And I did an internship after college at Planned Parenthood in Tunisia, and learned a lot more about that. And then came back and did an internship at The Nation, which is it's mostly your job is fact checking, but you can pitch things, and you have a kind of connection with the magazine after that. A lot of former interns at The Nation have gone on to write for them or do other things in journalism. And from there, I kind of took a very meandering route. I did some freelancing in Brazil, in the Middle East. I did a master's degree in human rights. I then realized that business, finance, and economics were really more relevant to how the world works than just, human rights as a legal framework, as a concept. It's very inspirational. It's not actually what makes the world go round. So then I thought, okay, if I really want to understand the world and I want to write journalism that has more explanatory power, I should have a better grasp of how resources are allocated, how decisions get made, how policy gets enacted, these kind of macro level things that really trickle down into people's lives. And so I became a business and finance reporter. I worked at Reuters, wound up covering economics for the Wall Street Journal. When you're writing about the US economy, that's really a story about economic inequality, declining social mobility, racial disparities in wealth, in job opportunities. And I think eventually I realized I really wanted to write about how that affected people on, how economics affects different aspects of our lives, and especially family life. And that kind of led me to my current beat, which is I cover different aspects of family, reproduction, gender. And I think I'm really lucky in that I've had at this point kind of training in different ways of thinking. So I can think about things from a human rights perspective. I can think about, kind of sociological perspective. And I can think of things from, with a more like economic class analysis. And ideally, I bring all of those together in a story.
What's your educational background? What were you interested in college? What was your major? Because I'm listening to you and thinking, wow, you have to have such a breadth of knowledge, right? To be able to tell like a human interest story that has some kind of feeling to it, but then also focuses on macroeconomics and sociology and global issues. So tell us a little bit about that.
Absolutely. So my undergraduate degree was in comparative literature. I studied French and Italian. French I had taken since grade school, and Italian, I had visited Italy once in high school. It was like a huge gift that my mom really, I don't know, it was the biggest treat. And I got to visit Italy and I just fell in love. And I decided I wanted to study abroad there. So when I was choosing a major, I went to Brown University, which is really unstructured and probably wasn't the best
school.
Probably wasn't the best fit for someone who's already a little kind of lost in the sauce as I was. But I chose comparative literature because I do think languages are important. If you're going to go to another place, even if you don't master the language, if you don't achieve total fluency, if you're going to be somewhere else, you, to the extent possible, need to be able to interact with people. As a journalist, your whole job is talking to people. And even though, of course, English is the dominant language, now that I'm back in the US and been based here for the last 11 years, I really wish I spoke more Spanish. It's, you know, there's huge Spanish speaking communities, especially in New York. And, you know, I wish I had better access to them and then wouldn't need to, you know, rely on an interpreter in certain situations. But so all that's to say, I started with comparative literature. I also believe that reading good writing is just still the best way I know of to kind of improve your own writing and also get inspired and get new ideas and learn new ways of thinking. So whether that's literature or nonfiction. And then before I moved to the Middle East, I did a master's degree in human rights. So that was in the sociology department at the LSE, but I also took a lot of classes from law professors. And so that's why I kind of think about getting a sort of sociological legal training. And then when I did a business and economics reporting degree at NYU. I was really lucky to be given a full ride there. You know, just a very practical note, like journalism is kind of a collapsing industry, as you saw in the cartoon video. Like that was a cartoon, but it's really serious. And if you're going to go into it, you should be mindful of that and look for ways to get, you know, training and things like that with a little student debt as possible, because it's not going to, you know, that can be a real millstone around your neck. So, but that was a great program because the business classes, you took journalism classes at the Journalism Institute, and then you took business classes and economics classes at the business school with other business school students. So that was like, you know, proper accounting classes, proper macroeconomic classes. And I actually hadn't taken that before. A lot of the other stuff about economics, like the history of economic ideas, economic thought, you know, what are the sort of big currents and debates, that I taught myself. I listened to, gosh, untold, I mean, dozens of episodes of, there's a podcast called Econ Talk, hosted by an economist named Russ Roberts. And he interviews all kinds of people about their books and their work and their ideas. And I would just have those on basically all the time. And, you know, I mean, that's one of the other things I wanted to mention, like, you know, journalism, I always think of, there's kind of two big components. One is just the training and craft. And I think, you know, that's something you hone over time. You can learn from professors, you can learn from mentors, you know, but at a certain point, it's kind of an instinct, like, what's the next question to ask? Where should I look for this information? You know, knowing to ask follow-up questions, knowing to, you know, every time you finish an interview, you say, who else should I talk to? And what should I have asked you that I didn't ask you? You know, there's certain things that become instinct, and you sort of hone these skills over time. The other thing is that when you're sort of figuring out what you're going to write about, I mean, if it's not assigned to you, if you're not hired into a newsroom, you know, to cover education or to cover health or to cover the state legislature, whatever it is, you know, you need expertise. You know, the only way you're going to be good at your job is if you know much more than the average person, and ideally more than any of your competitors. So, you know, you really need to, it helps to be really passionate about what you're covering. But, you know, I had an interesting period when I was covering shipping at Reuters and energy. And I have no real passion for the energy market or the shipping market, but my job was to beat Bloomberg. And so, you know, I wouldn't say I feigned passion, but I did my job, which was to, you know, go out and talk to everyone I could, and, you know, try to look for information in places where other people weren't looking. And so, you know, that was interesting for me, because for a period of my career, the passion and the sort of intellectual interest was taken out of the equation. And I always think of it as the period where I just focused on the craft and just focused on the skills. And so, you know, I think there's something to be said for that too.
Yeah, what I'm hearing too, I mean, there's always parts of our jobs that we don't like. I can't imagine feigning interest in shipping containers, but I guess we all do what we need to do. But what I'm hearing too is that your background wasn't like communications or journalism, and yet you kind of created like your own toolkit of all of these different disciplines that really, when they come down to it, focus on analysis, right? Like whether you're doing math and accounting, sorry, right? Or whether you're doing like human interest stories with like a comparative literature background, what we really need in the world are critical thinkers. And that is such a skill that both historians and journalists and a lot of other disciplines can help you to grow in. So can you tell us a little bit about your work and maybe the story that you're going to focus on today? I'm really excited to hear about it.
Absolutely. So I was going to talk about a set of stories that I reported with the support of the Pulitzer Center from Poland and Denmark. And this was kind of a package of stories. The general rubric was kind of who gets to have families today and why and under what circumstances and with what support or facing what kind of barriers. Because I think, for a long time we thought of like, kids are just, people meet and then they have kids, but today it's a lot more complicated. Well, first of all, that wasn't always the case. Many different groups had their reproduction challenged, coerced, but, people were sterilized against their will. Under the regime of slavery, families were torn apart. So first of all, historically, that's not always true, but, even today, there's a lot of really subtle kind of ways that some families are encouraged and discouraged. So just to give a sense of my own connection to this, I froze my eggs when I was 34. I did it again when I was 36. I had to go overseas to do it because much less expensive than in the US. And then it led me to ask this question, well, okay, if I were to use them and become a parent, what resources are at my disposal? What kind of support do I get from the government? What would I need to come up with on my own? Especially if I was a single parent, I thought, oh, this is going to cost a lot of money. The medical part costs a lot of money. The childcare part costs a lot of money. And I don't know if anyone's following it out, but there's a big bill that people are trying to pass, and at the federal level to make it so that childcare doesn't gobble up half your budget, or that this year people are getting small checks every month to help them raise a family. So all these questions were kind of front of mind because the US is actually quite unique in terms of how little support people get for their families governmentally. There's no mandatory paid family leave. There's very little support for young people unless you're kind of below the poverty line. And then there's a few federal programs and things. But so one place I was really interested in, I happen to be, this is just some insight into how story ideas come about. Sometimes they're completely serendipitous. I was at a fertility conference in Barcelona, learning about new medical advances and new, scientific papers and things that were being presented. And I wound up at a dinner for a group of people who do advocacy for fertility patients. I happened to be sitting across from a woman and I was kind of eavesdropping. And this woman was saying, yeah, so in Poland, single women who've frozen their eggs can't access their own eggs or the embryos that they've made. And I thought, hearing that as someone who'd frozen eggs herself, I was like, wow, that's outrageous. I froze my eggs and then, the idea that the government would say, oh no, you can't have them. So I wound up pitching the story to the New Yorker. They didn't take it at first. They wanted me to do a story that was domestically focused. Actually, I pitched it to a few other places that totally ignored me. And then I tried the New Yorker, and then they said, we can't assign it first. We need you to do something domestic because we wouldn't send someone overseas on their very first story for us. And then I went to report that story. Basically the idea is that the Polish government is very, the country is Catholic. The current government is very conservative, very aligned with the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church, for its own faith reasons, opposes IVF. And the government tried to ban it. There was this compromise law that said basically it's only for heterosexual couples. And single women were basically left out in the cold, including women who had made embryos before the law passed and then couldn't access them afterwards in order to go get pregnant. So that was one story I did, and that was a really, like, the whole reporting process. I mean, it was very hard to find these women. I guess I thought that the patient advocacy nonprofit, the NGO group that I had been in touch with had, a whole bunch of these women just lining up to talk to me. In fact, it's so stigmatized. It's so, there's so much shame and stigma associated with it. It was very difficult to get women to come forward. And it was only by luck that, I was able to connect with a few women while I was there. The other story I did while I was there was about you could call it almost like a universal basic income program that the government announced just a few years. It was like, I have to look, I think it was in 2015, but this government decided that they were going to support families with 500 zloty, which is the Polish currency, a month. That's about $120, $130. And this was for second-born children and above. And it was, this was another one where I talked to single mothers who thought that they were being left out because a lot of single mothers only have one kid. There were a lot of people who thought the government was like a little bit crazy, but they really appreciated the extra money. And, those are some people I interviewed, for example, in rural areas outside of Warsaw. And they said, this government is doing great by families. So we're going to vote for them. And so that was an interesting way that you see family almost as like a tool, a political tool around which governments can make policy and, embrace certain sectors of the population. I think we've seen that. Just to quickly draw an example to the US, there's a lot of contestation around the term family values, which is the party that embraces family values. Does opposing same-sex marriage mean that you're supporting family values? Does supporting, government-sponsored childcare or subsidized childcare mean you're supporting family values, or you're destroying them by, intruding on people's home lives? I mean, these are all questions that are really up for debate. I think, both in the US and in other countries, family and gender has become a huge kind of lightning rod. You're seeing it in Brazil, Hungary, and many other countries. And then another story I did on that same trip was in Denmark. I did a big piece for the New York Times Sunday Review about why birth rates are declining. And, some of the things we've just talked about, like policy supports for families, in Denmark, all those things are there. They have great family policy. They have paid parental leave of, 9 months or something like that. They have government subsidized childcare. They have all these things are in place, and yet still the birth rate is declining. And so I really wanted to see why that was. And, I think as with any question that's so personal, you're never going to come up with like one clear answer. But, one of the great things about going there was I probably talked to, 15, 20 people in like the 5 days I was there. I had interviews back to back. I actually wound up traveling to Denmark again, like 4 months later, just on my own to have a holiday, because I felt like I didn't really spend 3 days there, but 3 or 4 days there, just seeing all the things that I'd like run past, going from one meeting to another. So the first time I went there, which is when I was traveling there for work, it was, I met with policymakers, with fertility doctors, with, health ministers. I met with a lot of people sort of in their 20s and 30s, you know, who are in the middle of this sort of conversation with themselves, you know, to try to get a better grasp on like, well, if people aren't having kids in their late 20s anymore, early 30s, why not? What's going on? What are they doing instead? What are their concerns? What are their fears? And, you know, the chance to really go there and meet people and talk to them and, you know, understand the sort of cultural context they were in and be in the city and sort of see how people lived. I mean, all that stuff is really invaluable. And I mean, it's obviously really fun and it's a great treat. And it can be a little bit exhausting, but it's, you know, it's at the end of the day, it's a real privilege. And I feel like it's so important for the kind of journalism that, you know, was being discussed in that video where you're actually going somewhere and trying to get your head around things and then tell your audience, you know, to the best of your ability, what you saw and what you absorbed.
Thank you for that. I want to remind everyone too, especially students, there's a Q&A button. I feel like an influencer, like down below, like and subscribe if you want to send in any questions. But we'll continue this conversation. One of the things I'm hearing that is so fascinating is as a historian, like our own preferences in history come into the questions that we ask, right? So it's almost kind of interesting, like a horoscope, if you kind of see what people study and then you're like, oh, that's why. That's what led them into that question. And then they use, you know, the tools of objectivity and trying to have the least amount of bias as possible. So, right, your personal story kind of leading you into listening to that conversation and even piquing your interest. Was there anything that surprised or shocked you about what you were learning? I mean, it's just so new to me that the government would even make that kind of law. And to be honest, that sounds very scary, to have something from your body that, right, there's different definitions of what that is. And then to have your government tell you that you don't have access to it sounds really terrifying. Can you just share anything that surprised or shocked you as an American?
There were a few things. It wasn't even so much as an American. I think, you know, for me, it was very, there were a few things that really stand out from that trip. One was talking to the people who had pushed for for IVF to be banned. So having an interview with a very conservative Catholic group that does legal advocacy and that is very, very close to the government. I know that, you know, just to put my biases on the table, I know I disagree with them about a lot of things, but I have to say, like, one of the more sort of memorable and enjoyable parts was just going in and asking questions and listening to their answers and like pushing back where I felt appropriate or pushing them to be more specific or to be more precise, without debating them. You know, I'm not there to change their mind about anything. That's totally not my job. But, you know, if I am going to present their point of view, you know, I want to make sure to, you know, if I see an inconsistency or an incoherence in what they're saying, you know, it's also my job to draw that out or, you know, get them to think a little harder so that I'm actually giving the most well thought out or, you know, well-rounded version of their opinion to other people. And actually, I got pushback from people who are on the liberal and progressive side in Poland of even giving them a platform. But, you know, I don't think that you can say that, you know, this law, like you said, this law that sounds to you very, you know, out of left field. I mean, it's not out of left field. You have to understand like who this group is, you know, the fact that they're close with the government, you know, you have to know what their point of view is and what they're capable of to understand why this law is in place. The other thing that was interesting, I didn't talk about it, but the third story I did from Poland was about abortion access. And there's something that you always hear, I always heard it with respect to abortion in the US. People talk about pre-Roe days, or now you can even talk about post-Roe, possibly now in the US. But and I'm talking about Roe versus Wade, the Supreme Court decision from 1973 that made abortion legal in the US. Before that, people would always say, you know, if a woman wants an abortion, she will get one. And what was interesting covering the IVF side was women said the exact same thing to me about having a kid. If a woman wants a kid, she will get one, you know, and the thing that really brought that home was kind of, I was at an IVF clinic in Poland, and they had this poster that showed the developing like blastocyst, different stages of embryo development. And you looked at it and I just looked at it and thought, who is anyone to say when life begins? I mean, you look at this, you know, stage, and it's got little photos of, you know, at different weeks of development. And I just thought, this is above all of our heads. I mean, we can't, you know, it's very hard, but I think it's worth talking about it. And I think I kind of came away thinking, I wish we had more honest conversations about this, because I think it's emotional, it's spiritual, it's medical, it's psychological, it's economic. I mean, you know, all these questions are really, they're so multidisciplinary. To go back to your comment about sort of critical thinking and analysis, it's like the more sort of questions and trainings and methodologies and tools you can bring to a question, I think the better shape you're in. And so I'm really grateful for having exposure to you know, various disciplines. And those were, you know, I think those questions, like, how do we get beyond, you know, oh, Texas is this, or, you know, abortion is that, or, you know, I feel like there's such deeper questions here that we're not asking. And instead, these issues get to be political footballs, and, you know, citizens who have a stake in it are not really talking to each other about their own beliefs and, you know, why they, why, you know, they're just watching sort of laws being made in their name without really talking to one another or seeing if there's any common ground or anything like that.
You mentioned something about asking questions, Anna, and I thought this might be a good time to work in one of the questions from an audience member, Michael, who was asking about the fact-checking process. And I thought that was interesting because, you know, the questions you're asking while you're reporting, they don't really stop. Once you're done with your interviews, you have to keep going. And there's that big step between talking to everyone and putting it in print. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that in your journalism. It doesn't have to be for this story specifically, but maybe what your experience with fact checking has been, or.
Sure. Well, so I was a fact checker, which is great training. On most stories, you're your own fact checker. I like to think I'm my own fact checker, you know, for the first round. Like, once I file a story, I'll usually file a draft. I'll tell the editor it hasn't been fact checked yet, because in the editing process, a lot of things might get cut. Your editor might ask you, you know, 10 big questions. I mean, you have to go talk to every single person again. You know, there's a lot more steps between even when you've just written the story and when it gets published. So there's all the editing process. And, you know, once the text is kind of finalized, because there's also things that, you know, something that's legal or medical or, you know, otherwise technical terminology, you want to make sure you have the exact right text, that the words are not going to change. So once you have a text that looks pretty much final, that's when you start the fact checking process. There's some publications that also have in-house fact checkers. So the New Yorker is famous for that. And I've worked with some incredible fact checkers. I mean, I have a good friend who's a fact checker now at the New York Times Magazine. And, you know, some people I think feel like fact checkers are annoying. They're kind of pointing out oh, what about this? Or can you send me the right source for that? And to me, it's like, these are the people who are saving your, you know what, and like, I just endlessly saving your bacon, I guess is the way you can put it. And so I am endlessly grateful. I mean, when they catch a mistake, like, I'm horrified because I do try to be meticulous, even if it's not like officially fact checked. You know, I try to get everything right the first time. I mean, I know that, it's going to go through different rounds, but, you like to think you hand in something accurate, and that's always my goal. But the fact checking process is also a time to ask more questions, to clarify things. So it's almost like a chance to do additional reporting too. I mean, some of it is just like, can you point me to the graph, or the chart or the government document where, I can find this language of the legislation. Like that part's not that thrilling. You just need to be accurate. You need to have proper sources. And primary sources are always the best. And then in a lot of cases you send your transcripts or recordings to the fact checkers. This is like for the New Yorker, so they can play back and make sure that you wrote down the person's quote accurately. Believe with the New Yorker, they call everyone and they kind of paraphrase, like they say, I just want to make sure that, this is an accurate depiction of what you said. And if someone wants to clarify, they have the opportunity. So I've had, fact checkers come back and tell me, okay, they didn't really mean what they said the first time. They want to say this instead. And, that's kind of a negotiation. Like if it's someone I've interviewed for 3 hours and all of a sudden they want to say the opposite thing, sometimes I'll say, I don't think that's true. We have 3 hours of tape in which they, said X, not Y, or negative X, So, you have to also use your own judgment in those cases. But it can be really lengthy and time consuming, but it's really essential because that's how you know that what you're presenting to a reader is as accurate as possible. And that's really your like primary and almost like only duty as a journalist.
I see a few questions about religion, just dealing with different in different countries and everything. And I'm kind of curious, maybe this is taking it a different direction, but I think that a lot of times with journalists reporting on these issues that are sometimes seen as taboo is difficult. And I think religion combined with reproduction those are certainly two of the big ones. And you've got politics thrown in there too. So I was just wondering, maybe if there are any students in the audience who are interested in researching this, they might, want to get some primary sources, some oral history sources, or if they're interested in journalism, want to do some reporting. If you have any advice for students looking to, talk to people about these issues, which might be sensitive, might not want to re-traumatize individuals, what advice you might have there, Anna?
Well, I should be honest, I don't myself have a faith practice, but I understand that many people do. And it's interesting. I think we're in the midst of a larger cultural conversation about who gets to tell whose stories. So, I try to be really sensitive to the fact that like I'm not going to be able to fully step into, the experience of, for example, let's say the really conservative group in Poland that believes that, God really does not want embryos created through the IVF process, that, kids should only be had through heterosexual sex within the context of marriage. Like someone really believes that because of their like deeply and sincerely held faith, all I can do is take their word for it. And, I struggle to put myself in that person's shoes, but I also try to be as open and sensitive and like really hear what they're saying and really try to understand where they're coming from. With respect to, I think in general, when you're reporting, I also did a lot of reporting from the Middle East. You have to just keep as open and broad a mind as possible. I think, the Middle East was a place where I went like sort of in the context, after September 11th, 2001, it was after the invasion. It was like, after all these things about like, oh, Muslim women are so oppressed. And, there's all these sort of stereotypes and things that were also, again, related to politics related to sort of justifications for invasions and things. And there's all these stereotypes, and what you do in the end is just be as open-minded as try to get rid of all your preconceptions. You can always ask, like, well, how would I feel? You ask yourself sort of what groups you belong to, and how would you feel if someone, rather than seeing you as an individual, just wanted to make certain assumptions about you based on some group you belong to or part of the world that you're from or something like that. And with respect to people's trauma, I mean, there's no way to know what's going to be like traumatizing or triggering for someone, or when it's going to feel like a relief or an unburdening to someone to tell their story. And all I can say is, like, at that level, you just have to also go with your basic human empathy. So really reading someone's cues. And this is, I feel like, the best thing you can do, and you can practice this in any context. You can practice this as a student in class or with friends or with a partner. It's just like listening to someone really deeply. Don't have your phone in your hand. Don't be thinking about, your grocery list or anything like that. Like, really look at someone and see, like, are their eyes starting to tear up? Is something happening with their facial expression that's giving you a cue? Really read for that and listen empathetically. And I feel like that's the best thing you can do. And it's really not at all something that I or anyone should just do only in a professional context. It's really like how to be a good person, citizen, friend, sister or brother or whatever. So it's something you can practice all the time. And I think, you'll find that your relationships are much richer for it as well.
Before we move on to another great question that Holly has, I wanted to kind of be in dialogue with you about the question from a student about religion. Because what's really fascinating, right, is like we're all situated in space and time. And so our campus in Glendale, we're situated in the Armenian diaspora, which historically Armenia was the first nation to become officially Christianized. And so we do have a lot of Christian students, and I'm a practicing Christian. And what I would say, though, is just because you study something doesn't mean that you have to affirm it or deny it, right? So if you're using the tools in a historian's tool belt or a journalist, we all have bias. Like, if you have a brain, you have a bias. So there's no such thing as totally objective. But right, if you're practicing human empathy and using primary sources and analytical thinking skills, right? When I research slavery, that doesn't mean I'm pro-slavery, right? Or if I research, let me go on the record, absolutely not, right? Or abortion. And I know those things can be touchy, but not to branch out to a larger conversation, but you mentioned earlier, right, that we kind of become so polarized. And part of that is the role of social media in our world right now. You can just totally be bifurcated to people who only look like you, vote like you, practice your religion. And we need to listen to other people, which is what you do so well, right? Is tell me your story. What haven't I asked you? What don't I understand about this? And then share it with others. It doesn't mean you agree with it or would do it yourself. But if you're interested, take History 111 with me and we'll talk about what life was like for women before Roe versus Wade. Holly, you had some great questions to follow up with.
Yeah, let's see. I mean, I'm not sure which one I kind of want to get to first, but maybe since we're kind of talking about your broader career as a journalist, there's a question here from Robert about has there been a situation where you as a journalist were treated differently because of who you are, how you receive it? So maybe this, I feel like, just knowing how journalism is as a career, there are probably many times where, you've had to kind of adjust. So if you wouldn't mind speaking to that, Anna, maybe in this context of this story or just more broadly.
I think I have one advantage. I don't want to call it an advantage. I think I look ethnically ambiguous. I've been told, like, I know when I was a little kid, I was in like some ads for things for kids because I was kind of just like random ethnic looking kid. I happen to be, my mom is Chinese American and my dad is Eastern European Jewish American. But when I was in the Middle East, I looked like I lived in Lebanon, and people often thought mistook me for Lebanese until I opened my mouth. They could hear my, sort of inadequate Arabic. Same when I lived in Tunisia. I think being American, because the US has such a, how do I describe it? I don't know, imperial, neo-colonial, the US has a lot of power in the world. And I was living in the Middle East at a time when it was really flexing that power in the region, with a lot of death and destruction. I don't know that people, no one yelled at me, or in fact, one of a very vivid, there is a cliche, my experience well deserved about hospitality in the Middle East. And I remember visiting the refugee camp in Shatila. I was actually just there with an NGO worker, not doing a specific story, but just there visiting and seeing what it was like there. There's a lot of Palestinian families who live in this camp, and I believe now a lot of Syrians and people from elsewhere, because it's just a little bit informal housing and less expensive to live there than other parts of Beirut. And there was a Palestinian family, and at some point they had welcomed us into their home. I at some point mentioned that my father was Jewish, and this is a camp that was terrorized by the Israeli Defense Force during the Lebanese Civil War, with a lot of, it was basically a massacre. And the family just said, "That's no problem. You're here as our guest. You're welcome," and they served a meal of chicken, which, meat is quite expensive. They gave us Pepsi, which is also really expensive, for their sort of household economics. And that was something where I think it goes to that point where if you show up somewhere with humility and kind of openness, and try to project that and try to connect on a human level, that ideally you can transcend some of that. That doesn't mean that the power relations aren't there, that you shouldn't be really aware of them. I have, mobility thanks to a US passport. I could leave Lebanon if I wanted. There's so many things that you should be conscious of and not take for granted, and definitely, be aware of also, so you don't say something obnoxious by accident or assume that everyone's in the same situation as you. But, I think that there's also a lot of opportunities to just show up as an individual and relate to someone else as an individual.
Yeah, I think again, you're just talking about those soft skills, like being a good human, right? Almost like a doctor would have bedside manner. Like a good journalist isn't just about being smart and asking great questions and being a great writer, but part of that is building those relationships to get some of these sources. Can you speak to, for our students, what soft skills do they need to grow, right? So we've talked about what they could study, and your really amazing journey just in every discipline, basically. But what soft skills would you recommend that they work on growing?
I think the most important thing is curiosity. I don't know if that counts as a soft skill. Obviously, you need to know how to write and communicate. You need to be fairly persistent. Before this call started, earlier this morning, I was writing the third email, following up with people, just hey, still want to see if you, just following up, trying to write these polite things where it's maybe they really don't want to talk to me, or maybe they just forgot. But the only way I'm going to find out is if I email them 20 times. And maybe that will be when I finally give up. But, so persistence is definitely something you need. You have to be able to also not take things personally, because I think, if this were a friend who wasn't getting back to me after 20 emails, it probably at some point need to take the hint. But with journalism, you can't take it personally. You just have to kind of keep going after what you're going for. So if that's a piece of information, if that's a government agency that won't give you a response, or corporate headquarters that's being annoying. Like, you definitely just need to be persistent, brush it off. I even had one person for a piece that recently published. I kept having to follow up with her and ask her questions because my editor kept asking these follow-up questions, including some questions I wasn't totally comfortable with, but just like I felt like my responsibility was to the editor to try to get his questions answered. And she got really annoyed at me and kind of chewed me out. I could tell she was getting really tired of all my follow-up questions, including the ones that I believe she rightly found a little bit patronizing. But then the piece came out and she was thrilled with it. And she wrote me, a note to say, like, thank you for persisting, basically, even though I was getting, a little short. So I think that, and like I said, the listening, the being present, the not being, I think I even find this myself. If I'm on a really long interview and my phone is there because we're doing the call on speaker, like, do I have the instinct to check my email? But like, as soon as I do it, do I miss the last sentence the person said? Like, absolutely. So I think it's tough with digital communications. Obviously, if you're face-to-face with someone, you would never do that because it's so rude. Just the same way I hope you don't leave your phone on the table when you're having dinner with your friends and family. I hate that. But it's tough to be disciplined in that way. I think we're really used to turning to distractions and our devices and things, but that's something I would really practice because it's really critical for connecting with other people.
Well, we're coming to the end of our time with you today. I just really want to appreciate all of your candor and your stories and how you've made your work so accessible. There's been several links in the chat if anyone's interested in looking at the great work that Anna has done for the Pulitzer Center, as well as her personal website. For faculty only, so faculty only, you have been emailed, speaking of follow-up emails, by me a couple times. There is an event tonight that's private, professional development for faculty only with Anna. So please check your email for that link and to register if you would like to follow up for that. Yeah, you can send the link for reporting fellows. That would be wonderful. And also we have an event for the Pulitzer Center. We will have an info session. So if you're not sure like what this whole consortium thing is, it is new to GCC. We just launched it this semester. If you want to get in on the ground floor, we would love to have you. So please look for details. We put the link on the page. There'll be campus-wide emails as well as social media. And just save the date. It's Monday, October 12th from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. The Zoom link and flyer and all the other great details will be on the page. Super easy. Glendale.edu, search bar, Pulitzer Center. Bam, you're there. No questions to even be asked. Holly, go ahead and take it from here. And thank you everyone for attending.
Yeah, I just really wanted to say another thank you to everyone. And also thank you to the Pulitzer Center. I wanted to thank the PIMCO Foundation for the funding that allows us to do this. And of course, thank you to everyone at Glendale for welcoming us on your campus virtually, the students for attending, and Anna, of course, couldn't have done it without you. So hope to see some of you this evening and hope to see even more applications for the fellowship. We're really looking forward to hearing about your work and hearing about you. So with that, I will say good afternoon and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.